Hi guys, welcome back to another Lanterna English tutoring video. Today we're going to look at how to nail your English I.O. So this is your English individual oral. In standard level, it's worth 30% of your overall grade, and in higher level, it's worth 20% of your overall grade. So it's really worth getting to grips with it. I know it was the piece of work that I was most nervous about by far throughout my whole career. So it should be nice to have some guidance. Today we're going to look at how you structure it, how you approach it, how you plan it, and also finally how you practice it. Okay, so let's get started. Now the first thing you need to think about is the structure of the individual oral. Okay, so this is a 10-minute presentation followed by a 5-minute Q&A. You really need to have this 10-minute presentation learned and absolutely nailed, and you need to have some idea of what your teacher's going to ask you in that 5-minute question and answer session. Okay, your sources that you need are, first of all, one literary source. Now, this is a 30 to 40 line extract which you're allowed to take into the individual oral, and it has to be from a text that you've studied with your class. The second thing is one non-literary source of your choosing. So this can literally be anything. It can be something like a poster, an advert, a film, it could be a political cartoon, it could even be the lyrics to a song. Okay, so you really have quite a lot to play with here. It's pretty interesting and you can really have fun with it. And the main thing that you answer in this I.O. is you need to answer how a global issue is presented in these sources of your choosing. Okay, we'll get on to what a global issue is in a second, but the really key idea is that throughout this presentation, as if it's an essay, you have to make sure you're addressing how the global issue is presented and what kind of consequences this has. Okay, what is the message behind the presentation of this global issue? Before that, we'll just look at the criteria quickly. Okay, so first of all, you need to show knowledge, understanding, and interpretation. This is one of 4 marking sections. So you need to demonstrate that you understand what the source is saying about the global issue, and that you have your own interpretation, which you then back up with analysis and evaluation. This part of evaluation is actually really key, and you can bring it into the conclusion and say which source you think is more effective at portraying the global issue in a certain way. Following on from this, focus and organisation. Now, especially because it's a presentation, it can feel kind of up in the air. And if you don't speak clearly and articulate and plan your presentation very clearly, then it won't be apparent to the examiner what the structure is. So we really need to make sure we're dividing this up into sections of intro, your sort of body paragraphs, as it were, and then finally a conclusion. And the last thing is language. Okay. It's no good going into this presentation with loads of good evidence and loads of good ideas, but not communicating yourself in a formal and academic way. It's absolutely essential that you use academic register. You don't use words like or anything like that, and you don't end a sentence with just so yeah, which a couple of my students have done before. So make sure you're speaking in an academic way, you breathe, you keep yourself calm, and all of this will go off without a hitch. So, on to planning. How do we actually approach the planning of the I.O.? The first thing to do is identify our global issue. Okay, now this is defined by the IB as a significant transnational issue that has an impact on daily life, right? So it could be something like wealth or gender inequality. It could be something like political liberty. It could be something like in the environment, climate change. Okay, you've got a whole range of things to choose from. Some of these topics are really interesting, so you should definitely have fun with it. And one of your sources, as I said, has to be something you studied. I have a student recently who studied 1984 by George Orwell. As a result, we decided that the global issue we would undertake in this I.O. would be mass surveillance. Okay, clearly it's significant, it's transnational, and it is an issue that has an impact on daily life. It's also really interesting if these issues are very current and important. We have a lot of worries about mass surveillance in terms of how we use our phones and how social media uses our data. So this is a really rich topic that we can use. And then again, we always must bear in mind when we're planning, how is the global issue portrayed by both of these sources, and why is this consequential? Is it trying to teach us something? Is it trying to transmit a certain message about this global issue? In this case, mass surveillance. Presumably, we're going to be warned about the consequences of mass surveillance. The second thing we have to do is select our sources. So, like I said, your global issue has to be drawn from one of the texts you have studied. So we already have our literary source in 1984. The non-literary source can be absolutely anything, right? So we can have a lot of fun with it. Like I said, it could be an advert, a poster, a film or cartoon, but we have to make sure that it reflects the same global issue as our literary source that we've already studied. Third thing, structuring your response, okay? Like I said, because this is a speech, it can sometimes risk being a little bit rambly and being unclear, okay? So we really absolutely have to make sure that we have a very, very clear structure. We also need to make sure we have our timings absolutely nailed. So you will need to practice this a lot beforehand. We need to fit our speech, our presentation into 10 minutes and keep our timing strict, okay? Now, if you memorize the speech, it does run the risk of you just sort of reciting it. So another thing you have to really, really focus on is make sure that you remain interested, you keep a conversational tone, you act like this is a spontaneous presentation that you're giving from your bullet points, as opposed to something you've just memorized for the last 3 days and just have to spurt out in the exam. So, the first thing we have to do is introduce the global issue and the sources, okay? So, in this part we have to say why the global issue is significant, mass surveillance because it represents a threat to our liberty and to our privacy. Then we have to introduce the sources, okay? We have to say what type of source it is. Is it a book? Is it a cartoon? We also have to say who the author is. George Orwell, for example, for 1984. And we also have to address when this is from, because the context is also quite significant, okay? So you introduce your global issue, you introduce what type of source it is, the name of the source, and the author. Then what we're going to do with this, to really make our response sophisticated, is we're going to analyse by themes, okay? And we're going to see how these themes transmit how the global issue is portrayed, how they communicate the author's view on the global issue. So for example, theme 1, we could have imagery in both of our sources. And we spend 3 to 4 minutes talking about how the imagery in both sources transmits how the author feels about this global issue. We do the exact same thing for theme 2. So if theme 1 is imagery, let's say that theme 2 is something like the use of language, okay? Again, we spend 3 to 4 minutes on this. Then finally, what we do is we conclude. We say how the global issue is presented, how this is achieved by the authors via their use of language, for example, and imagery. So that's our theme 1 and our theme 2. And then we say why this is consequential. Okay, why is it important to think about this global issue? Why is it relevant that you've done this presentation, right? You've made yourself aware of this global issue, you've educated yourself, and what you're really trying to do here is say to the examiner, this is why it's important. And now another thing you can do in this conclusion, which will really, really push your marks up, is to evaluate a little bit. And that is you saying which of the sources you think is more effective at portraying this global issue in a certain way, which you think is maybe more useful, okay? So, now for the body of our I.O., right? So this is theme 1 and theme 2. I just want to unpack this a little bit and make it a bit more clear. As mentioned, you want to structure your response thematically, instead of just analysing one source and then analysing the second one. It's a lot more sophisticated if you analyse it by the themes, as opposed to piece by piece. So, let's take a look at the sources that I've chosen. So, on the left you have an extract from 1984 by George Orwell. As mentioned, it's less than the maximum of 40 lines, okay? And on the right you have a political cartoon, right, from a newspaper, a magazine, or some such place, which also addresses the same global issue of mass surveillance. I said for theme 1, we could focus on imagery. Now, because our non-literary source is a cartoon, it's going to be more about imagery than anything else, okay? So, for example, in this, we could say that there are literally the eyes of the government through a phone, through a laptop, through a television screen, and through the window, okay? So it's iterating that the author feels a certain way about this global issue. How does he feel? He feels that mass surveillance is risky, that it robs us of our privacy, and as you can see by the figure by the door, it really stresses us out. It's not good for us at all. So that's one way that we can talk about the imagery in this source and how that can be put into theme 1. Then what we do is we address the other source, 1984, and we think about some imagery in that. For example, on line 13, we have the image of a helicopter skimming between the roofs, and then on line 15, the police patrol snooping into people's windows, okay? What we can say here is that similarly, Orwell also uses imagery in order to transmit his ideas about this global issue, about mass surveillance. Clearly, he also thinks it's invasive. He thinks it also gives the government too much control, okay? And it's good to also pick out individual words here. So like the helicopter skimming down between the roofs. We have this image of this massive, powerful machine just going between rooftops very nimbly and very quickly, which reflects how big the state apparatus and mass surveillance can become. Then we can think about theme 2, right? Because one of our sources is literary, we must focus on language at least at some point. So we can think about, for example, the casual tone that Winston has when he mentions the thought police in line 26. The fact that his tone is casual here makes us think that Orwell realizes that mass surveillance can become ingrained and it can become not even a significant thing for people, which in itself is very worrying. Thus, Orwell is trying to communicate that we are at risk of having mass surveillance integrated into our daily lives. Equally, we can focus on the language in the political cartoon. Even though there are fewer words, there is still plenty to talk about. For example, how all of the words are in capital letters. It's not saying you can trust the government, it's you can trust government. It's very harsh, it's very severe, and it makes the reader think that mass surveillance could be a tool by which the government enforces good behaviour. We could also talk about how the language and the words are broken up into different speech bubbles. It's as if the person in the source, in the cartoon, is having this message drilled into him from all these different angles, from his phone, from his TV, from his laptop, and from the outside world. So we can see that the way the language is positioned is significant as well. So it's really important that we analyse by these themes because it just makes our response a lot more sophisticated, okay? It will also make it more clear for the marker and keep them far, far more engaged. If you're talking about the sources together as opposed to one by one, it makes your answer a lot more sophisticated and the marker will likely push you up into that 6 or 7 grade boundary. Finally, there's the issue of practice. Okay, it's all well and good planning this presentation, but if we don't know how we can memorize it or practice it and be prepared for the presentation, then it's going to be a lot harder to get good marks. So, first thing is that really practice does make perfect. You want to prepare your presentation and plan it for as long as possible before the actual I.O. And once it gets close to the I.O., you want to practice it as much as possible. Now, you are allowed to bring in 10 bullet points to take into the I.O. But other great tactics exist to memorize it, such as writing things out with pen and paper. I think there's a tendency too much nowadays to just work on a screen, and it really makes stuff hard to actually integrate into your mind and to properly memorize. So just take a pen to paper, write out what you're going to say, do that a couple times over, and you're far more likely to remember stuff. Another good way is to therefore write out this script in full, and then continuously condense it until you're left with those 10 bullet points that you can bring into the examination. When you do this, your 10 bullet points will then act as more of a prompt and will remind you of longer sentences and longer paragraphs that you can then speak and give in a presentation format. Finally, you can record yourself presenting. Now, this isn't a particularly popular tactic, but it is very effective. Just pop in your headphones, read out your speech from your script, and you can listen to yourself over again. Do this a lot of the time in the days before your I.O., and I promise you, you will come out really confident and you will really understand what you're going to say, why you're going to say it, and how you're going to deliver it. This will also help you keep a conversational tone, keep interested, because you will be more familiar with the material as opposed to just trying to remember it and get it out. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, and I hope that you've got some now useful tips and tricks to combat that I.O. and to really get more confident with it. What you can do now is search us online for online private tutoring if you want to chat about this a little bit more. You can visit us at www.lanternaeducation.com and you can book some online tutoring through the little panel that I've screenshotted there. I've been Finn. Thank you very much, guys, for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.